Today I'm going to tell you about potentially the unluckiest bloke to become the head of an airline in recent years.
Jacinda Ardern confirmed today Omicron is circulating in Auckland.
I think we're probably going to see more vaccinations rolled out.
Air New Zealand flies 51 aircraft, much larger aircraft.
I've done a video on Air New Zealand's history before, but interestingly, they hired a new CEO a month before the COVID pandemic. A literal month. This bloke was hired with all things looking up and the pandemic at the time being treated like a passing minor sickness. Kind of like the Taylor Swift of flus. And I mean that in the sense that her music is infectious and there's hardly a person on earth who hasn't heard of her. And yet here we are. After 2 long years of the airline industry suffering from what Josh Revel calls getting a colonoscopy from Edward Scissorhands, this new CEO still stands at the helm of an airline that has for the most part survived the entire ordeal. So without further ado, shall we take a look at the man at the top of Air New Zealand? From 2014 to 2019, Greg Foran was the CEO of an absolute giant of the retail world, Walmart. That's right, this man was at the wheel of a company of over 1 million employees, over 4,600 stores stretched across a truly diverse range of retail sub-industries. Born a Kiwi, it's fitting that in February of 2020, he returned back to Aotearoa to be the new CEO of Air New Zealand. And as reputation would prove, Greg was good at what he does. In the time that Greg was at Walmart, the company pocketed a cool average of just under $15 billion annually. And you're probably thinking, oh yeah, sure, but he's probably one of those corporate asshat types that has no concept of what it means to be a cog in the machine of a big company, physically working to earn a living within even one store. And to that I say, you are wrong. Because this bloke does not consider himself to be fluent in the operation of a company until he has experienced every integral part of the business firsthand in a hands-on capacity. When he was at Walmart, he would go out of his way to work on the floor in a customer-facing capacity. He would work in the stock and inventory sectors, and in lower management to get an adequate emotional understanding of what it's like to work in each individual role within the company. And not in the ScoMo sense of like turning up, putting a Walmart vest on and getting 10 photographers to take a picture of him pushing a trolley back into a trolley bay and calling it a day. No, I'm talking like days, even weeks, immersing himself in different functions of the company. And when Greg started at Air New Zealand, he did the exact same thing there too. With some assistance, he was checking in passengers for a flight, he was making coffee for the captains aboard the flights, having conversations with the workers on the ground that make the wheels turn every single day. However, the first 18 months of this man's job were extremely difficult. Within literally a week of starting, Air New Zealand were forced to can their Auckland to Shanghai route due to little baby COVID growing up so fast in Wuhan. But according to Greg himself, even making that decision holds similar threads to working in retail. And in a really cool piece talking with Thomas Haynes, he said that over time, I've felt that there is more in common than there is different. The fundamentals of retail will ultimately help us recover and grow as an airline. To Greg, this meant isolating and expanding the airline's focus on the customer and their experience with the airline. But we'll get more into that later. First, let's take a look under the hood at Air New Zealand during the pandemic and how Greg Foran and his team at the top worked to keep the airline awake over the last 2 years. As with every airline during the COVID pandemic, Air New Zealand had to reevaluate how to best utilise their fleet, because suddenly a vehicle designed for passengers won't be taking any passengers. So what do you do if you now have 14 787s, 7 777s and a whole bunch of A321neos that you can't use for their primary purpose? Greg Foran's fleet strategy went like this. The likelihood is that the airline will have retired their 777 aircraft by the year 2027, so naturally by May of 2020, all 7 of their 777s were put into storage and the airline opted to keep with the more fuel-efficient 787s to keep up the now limited services and operations. Jeez, that was more 7s than you'd find in a trendy brunch cafe on a Sunday morning. Air New Zealand's fleet of A321neos and 787s are exactly the type of fleet suitable for introducing more sustainable fuel options going forward, and Greg Foran has commented since he began at the airline about how he hopes to see Air New Zealand be one of the first airlines to utilise the technology of hydrogen or sustainable aviation fuels when the technology is ready. Believe it or not, the toughest decision during COVID for Greg wasn't to sideline some of the aircraft. No, the toughest decision was having to stand down a third of the airline staff due to lower operating parameters. And if there was one area of the airline where staff numbers were affected, it was passenger services and pretty much any staff that worked primarily in passenger operations at the airline. Not to mention the Air New Zealand pilots with a 777 type rating who are now out of a job for the foreseeable future. But you know what? If there's 2 areas of the airline that didn't have to shed staff, it's air cargo and domestic operations. During COVID, Air New Zealand used their 787s to ferry freight all around the world through New Zealand, and it gave the airline's air cargo division a great opportunity to develop and improve. But as much as Greg and his team made the important decision to develop their air cargo program, his main focus through COVID was shifting the airline's focus away from strengthening its international operations and rather focusing on creating an airtight domestic operations network. And some may say the airline was already shifting its focus away from international operations after the carrier made the decision in 2019 to slowly phase out its Auckland to London route. But in coming into the head honcho role in 2020, Greg was quick to support the decision because he too could see that there was work to be done back home. Because while New Zealand was shut off to the rest of the world in an attempt to reach COVID-0, internally it was full steam ahead. The airline's A321neos were shifted from trans-Tasman routes and placed on domestic routes as both the airline and the Kiwi government aggressively marketed domestic tourism across the country. And suddenly, as the summer of 2021 hit, New Zealand had one of the busiest summers for domestic travel on record, as Kiwis travelled everywhere from north to south of the nation for a more hassle-free and mostly COVID-free holiday experience. All of these shifts and developments seen in the last 2 years have ultimately been the main reason for the airline's survival. Greg Foran was handed an airline at the beginning of one of the toughest periods for airlines globally, and yet here we are in 2022 and the airline is returning to regularly manned trans-Tasman passenger services, and as of mid-April, Aussies are also allowed to come and check out Aotearoa once again. Well done to all of the pieces of the pie at Air New Zealand, and well done to Greg Foran. You passed the ultimate airline beginner's test as a CEO. Righto, that's all from me. Chuck the video a like and subscribe if you're not, because there is plenty more where this came from. See you next time.